chapter 3 tonight. As I said a minute ago, it will be a shorter message because of all the business that we have to take care of tonight in conference. But we began a couple of weeks ago a series on Joshua. We pretty much introduced him in the first week, and last time we were here we looked at Rahab in chapter 2. But tonight we're going to get into chapter 3 and 4, and simply titled tonight, Crossing the Jordan. We're going to look at the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. I realize I'm speaking to a Sunday night crowd as I look around here, people that have probably been in church for quite a while. Most people here probably know the account of what we're going to talk about tonight, but for a lot of people, the parting of the Red Sea gets a lot of the credit. Right after leaving Egypt, after the 10 plagues, Moses raises the staff, and maybe it's because of the movie. Maybe Moses is more popular than Joshua, but we know the story of Moses using that staff and parting the Red Sea to leave Egyptian slavery. A lot of people, maybe outside the church or maybe new believers, might not realize that God did it a second time through Joshua, but this time to part the Jordan River for them to enter the promised land. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. If you have your Bibles and you're in Joshua chapter 3, the Bible gives us this narrative of Joshua's life. We'll read it here in just a second. Not going to get quite into it yet, but want to set the stage again because we weren't here last week with the storm, and the week before that was the camp meeting. And so just to kind of reestablish the context before we read the verse, 40 years has passed. I mentioned Moses parting the Red Sea, the 10 plagues and all that. It was 40 years ago. It wasn't supposed to have been that way. But because of the complaining, because of the bickering, because of their fear about the 10 spies that came back with a bad report, because of various things, God finally said enough. And he said that older generation would wander until they died off. And so we now come to a place where, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, nobody in the whole camp of Israel was alive at the event that I just mentioned. They weren't there when the Red Sea was parted. They weren't there in Egyptian slavery. They would have no doubt heard stories, possibly like this. Hey, Mom, why do we walk around the desert all day, every day? And so then they would hear the stories, but they weren't alive for it. They no doubt heard all about the plagues and all about this God that delivered them from Pharaoh. They no doubt heard all about it, but I can't help but wonder, for some of them, was it our parents' stories and not really ours? Their parents were that complaining generation that was really just dying off, and they were waiting for all the funerals to take place so that they could eventually go to the promised land. That's really the situation they were in. And so they heard these great stories from back in Mom and Dad's day, from back when Grandma and Grandpa were out there, but it wasn't their story. It wasn't their history. And in some ways, it might not have even felt like their God. And so what we're going to see here tonight, it's very similar to what had already happened in the book of Exodus, but it's happening now to a new generation, to the next generation of Israelites. So the first thing that we're going to see tonight simply is this, that the waters were parted. If you're in chapter 3, we're going to read verse 17. Actually, let's read 13 first and then 17. 13 says, this is God speaking. It says, when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord, that's the ark of the covenant, the Lord of all the earth, he's saying that when their feet shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. That's what God's telling them is going to happen. When you step into the water, this is a little bit different than the way the Red Sea was parted. The Red Sea, Moses lifts up that staff, and the waters are pulled back like a curtain. It would have been pretty easy to walk across on dry ground at that point. God has already worked the miracle. And with Pharaoh bearing down on you, there's nowhere to go except forward, and so that's what you're going to want to do anyway. But God doesn't do it this time that way. He doesn't say, when Joshua raises up his staff, I will pull back the water. No, he says, when the priest and the Ark of the Covenant, when you guys are physically in the water already, then it will stop. This is going to take a lot more faith. They're not walking across on an already dry ground. God says, when your feet are resting in the water, then I'll turn it off like a faucet. Then the water will stop flowing up from the north. It'll stop flowing, and eventually it's going to trickle down, and you'll be able to go on dry ground. But think about the faith it would take. As you begin to wade out in that water, God, you sure about this? There's no boats for them to get in. There's no bridge for them to cross. We don't know how deep the water would have been, and maybe at this time of year, how many of them. Remember, there's children, there's cattle, there could be infants, there could be elderly. And they couldn't just put him in a yacht or a ferry and get him across. And God says, when you actually step in it, when you get out in the water, then I'm going to work this miracle. Verse 17 shows us what happened. It says, now, pretty much just like 13 says, now the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. Not on the shores, but they had to wade out in there. They got to the middle of the Jordan, and all of Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan River. God pulled back the waters in a different way, but a similar event, and he allowed them to cross on dry ground, following the Ark of the Covenant. Of course, the Ark of the Covenant was not there when they crossed the Red Sea. This is a newer addition for the Jordan River. But you see what God has them do here. They have to enter the Promised Land. They have to get there some way, and so God works this miracle to allow them to get there. And this has to be something that will be used to build the faith of the people, this younger generation. They heard the parents' stories, and now they're getting to experience it for themselves as they're going to cross this Jordan River on dry ground. So where are they when they cross the Jordan River? They're in the Promised Land. In Canaan, yes, but remember, this is the land all the way back in the days of Abraham when God promised, I will give you a land to your descendants. They will be innumerable. And Abraham had to pass that promise on to Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And now here they are, more than 4 centuries later, they're finally going to cross into that Promised Land. So it's a little bit different than crossing the Red Sea. Think about the differences between the two, and we can maybe see a little bit of symbolism here. When they crossed the Red Sea, they were leaving Egypt. But when they crossed the Jordan River, they were entering Canaan. Both were foreign lands. But when they crossed the Red Sea, they were leaving a foreign land behind. When they crossed the Jordan River, they were entering their Promised Land. When they crossed the Jordan River, they were leaving slavery. When they crossed the Red Sea, they were leaving slavery. But when they crossed the Jordan River, they were entering rest, the land of rest. In Deuteronomy and Exodus both, God began to speak to Moses about Promised Land rest. He kept talking about after you've wiped out all your enemies and when you rest in the land. We see that word rest over and over and over when God speaks through Moses. They were leaving slavery. There's no rest in slavery, is there? Man, it was work, 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 work. It was the taskmasters cracking that whip. It was saying, build more bricks, build them faster, build these buildings for us. They left behind slavery when they crossed the Red Sea, and they entered rest when they crossed the Jordan River. When they crossed the Red Sea, for many of them, they were leaving their life without God. But when they crossed the Jordan River, do I keep saying these backwards? When they crossed the Red Sea, they were leaving their life without God. When they crossed the Jordan River, they were entering their land with God. And so these two bodies of water that are parted or dried up or however we want to define it, they kind of bookend 2 things for us. How prior to any of this, Israel is a slave nation with no real God. Stories of their God, but as far as we know, no real relationship. And then we have on the other side of the Jordan, we have them in their Promised Land, their land of rest, with their God. That's why the Jordan River is symbolic of entering heaven. You know, we sing that old hymn, on Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a watchful eye, cast some kind of eye, longingly looking over there. And we have these songs, we have these metaphors about crossing the Jordan River. And we say, you know, when this life is over and I cross over that river, or that Jordan River, I'm going to be in the Promised Land. And so this is kind of symbolic of how we live our lives. How God can take us from before we knew Him, when we were without God, slaves to sin, even living as strangers in a foreign land down here. But God can take us on the other side of that river to our Promised Land of rest with God for all of eternity. And so we look at these 2 simple events, and I kind of see a snapshot of the Christian life, a kind of bookending it and what we know will finally happen to us when we cross, metaphorically, that Jordan River. How did God do it? How does He dry up the river? We know how He did it with Moses, with the staff, and how God pulled it back like a curtain. That's certainly a miracle. How does He do it here with the Jordan River? They wade out into it, and the water just kind of slowly slows down and trickles to a stop, and then eventually there's no water there. I found this account of the year 1267, so a long time ago. This is 2018. In the year 1267, on December 7th and 8th, it was reported that the Jordan River was completely stopped up. Beginning about midnight on December 7th of 1267, the dunes at the bank of the river completely collapsed, and they formed a dam that stopped up the river. It's believed that if it happened in 1267, it's probably happened several times, maybe every couple of hundred years or so, an event like this would happen, where the Jordan River at midnight December 7th completely came to a stop. And it wasn't until 10 a.m. on December 8th that all that backed up water eventually pushed through and the waters came roaring back to life. Is it possible that that's exactly what God did? He didn't pull it back like a curtain this time. He said, when you walk out there, the waters will begin to stop. It's possible that God knew in the days leading up to this that the dunes were about to collapse again, that they were about to dam up the Jordan River, that within just a matter of time they would completely come to a stop, and there would be this 10-hour window where they could walk through on dry ground. We don't know if that's how it happened, but this shows us maybe that's exactly how God decided to do it. It's a miracle no matter how you slice it. Whether God knew about it or made it happen in his omniscience, or because God is completely over nature, maybe God just kind of like snapped his fingers and made it happen. But we certainly understand people could be like, oh, that's impossible. It's not possible. We know of at least once in history when the Jordan River has completely come to a stop. And God could have used this naturally occurring phenomenon to stop the Jordan River. Or maybe God just said the word and he made it happen. But either way, we know that it's possible for an event like this to have happened. And so we see that the waters were parted. We see they were able to pass over on dry ground. But there's one more thing they did before they really entered the land. Number 2, we're going to see that the stones were piled. In chapter 4, look at the first verse. It says, when all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, a man from each tribe, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you will lodge tonight. I would have wanted that job. 12 people, one from each tribe. They had to pick up a big stone and carry it with them all the way to the other side of the Jordan River. Joshua probably would have picked somebody stronger than me. But he would have picked out 12 people, one to represent every tribe, and said, from this dry ground that we're crossing over, pick up a stone. Everybody's going to grab one. And when we get on the other side of the river, we're going to pile them up and we're going to build the first monument in the promised land. We see in verse 8, it says, and the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded. And they took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them into the place where they lodged and laid them down there. So they obeyed. Why? We see in verse 21. I'll finish the chapter. He said to the people of Israel, Joshua says, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For Yahweh Elohim, for the Lord your God, dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God, just like he did to the Red Sea, when he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and that you may fear the Lord your God forever. Joshua says, one day your kids are going to ask, hey, Dad, what's with that big pile of stones right there at the bank of the Jordan River? What's that pile of stones about? And Joshua says, here's what you're going to tell them. That is a monument, son. That's a monument, daughter. That's something that we built because of what the Lord, our God, my God and yours, what he did for us. That's a testimony of the fact that God dried up the water and we were able to pass through on dry ground. Don't you ever forget it, young man. Don't you ever forget, young lady, what God did when you were just a baby in our arms. Or maybe you weren't even born yet, but don't you ever forget what God has done for us, so that you can always know what kind of God you serve. And not just you, but everybody else, that the whole world, meaning everybody here that sees it, will know that God is mighty. Will know what the hand of God can do, that they may learn to fear the Lord your God. Not to just be terrified of him, but to know who he is, to respect him, to have a fear of his judgment, to come to understand you better submit to this God. You better do what this God says. And this simple pile of stones can be a testimony to the entire world. We have a lot that we can learn from this quick passage, from just a simple illustration, what 12 rocks can do for the nation of Israel. We teach our kids about certain things in history, things that are important. We teach our kids about Thanksgiving, that first Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and Indians. Or we teach our kids about things like World War II and how we rose up and battled back the Nazis and destroyed the Third Reich. We teach our kids, or at least we used to, about the founding of this country. We used to teach the truth, how it was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and now we want to remove any acknowledgement of God from the equation. But we teach our kids things because we understand what happens if just a single generation forgets or does not know. One generation, and I don't want to get into politics, but don't we see this with millennials today that think socialism is a cool idea? When your generation, your parents' generation, risked everything because of socialism, because it leads to communism, and communism leads to dictatorships, and dictatorships lead to Holocausts, and Holocaust leads to World War II. You know that. You saw it play out before your eyes. And you answered the call, and you went to war, and you beat them back so that one day your kids wouldn't have to grow up in a communist country. And now our college campuses say, let's give socialism a chance. Well, they don't know their history, and no one's teaching them their history. Nothing against our school teachers or our administrators. Y'all are fantastic. But I mean, as a whole, the way our country is going, this agenda to rewrite so much of history. And it's important that we preserve it so that we don't make the same mistakes. If we gloss over the mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them again. We want everybody to understand why our freedom is important, what our freedom cost us, the people that died to give us this freedom. If we don't acknowledge them on things like Memorial Day, or honor them on Veterans Day, or go down to the monuments and read their names off of the wall, we forget that freedom actually came with the cost of someone's blood, of someone's limbs, of someone's livelihood, of someone's freedom, so that we can have it. If we don't teach our children this stuff, then they're not going to understand that it's something to be preserved from their generation. I don't know if we had to answer the call today, if we could find enough people willing to take up arms again and defend this country. It's important that we teach the next generation. Let's put America aside for a second and think spiritually speaking. Joshua said, when your kids ask what it's about, we better be able to tell them the truth about God, because if they forget, then they're going to end up serving Baal. They're going to end up serving Moloch and Asherah and all the other gods that they would, well, one day serve anyway. But it's important that we teach our kids what God has done for us. That we have a pile of stones in the living rooms of our homes. That when our kids say, what's this about? I don't mean literal stones, but we can point to our kids and say, let me tell you what God has done for me. Let me tell you what God has done for us. Let me tell you what God has done for you, so that you never forget the God that we serve. So that you never forget that God's hand is mighty. So that you always fear the Lord our God. How do we do that? Without building a pile of stones in our living room. We do that by telling our kids the things that God has done in our past. The things which God has delivered us from. Tell your kids, your grandkids, tell them your testimony about how you were out of church and wandering from God and He got a hold of you. Tell them about the times when there was no money to pay the bills, but you gave your tithe anyway, and there was a check in your mailbox the day that the bill was due. You tell them about the time when the doctor said there's nothing we can do, you have weeks to live, and now all these years later, here I am. You tell your kids about the miracles that God has worked for you, lest they forget what kind of God we serve. I said this morning we could probably start taking testimonies of answered prayers in our lives. Tonight I thought about doing that, but with going into conference and stuff here in a few minutes. But just think in your own life, do you have a story, a testimony, something God has done in your life, a way that God has come through? I see some of you nodding your heads. And that warms my heart to see. If you have a story, share it with somebody. Don't keep it to yourself. Because just like we don't want to lose one generation of Americans and think about what that could do to America, what if we lose a generation of our kids? What if the kids that are growing up now never open their Bibles, never go to church? Maybe they do when we drag them, but what about when they turn 18? Or what about when they go off to school? Can we afford to lose a generation of kids to not learn who Jesus is? And it used to just be assumed. We grew up in three generations in church. We sat by my parents and my grandparents. We don't see that anymore, do we? We look around churches, that's just not the norm anymore. We can't lose this next generation. So what do we do about it? Well, we teach them. We tell them. We show them. Our kids, our grandkids, our nieces, our nephews, and if all else fails, a stranger's kids down the street. But we better make sure that we are telling the next generation the truth of who God is. Any opportunity that we get, we've got to do it. Even if we just have a couple of minutes, we've got to tell them. Tell them who God is. Tell them what God has done. And tell them what God can do for them. Joshua understood the importance of the next generation remembering what God had done. We better make sure that we teach the next generation what God has done for us, lest we lose the next generation. I'd like to have a time for us to pray tonight, so I'm going to ask you to stand up where you are. And the message tonight might not be the type of thing where you got convicted of some sin, or you feel anything specific about what we talked about, but maybe tonight you want to pray for some kind of burden that you have. Or maybe tonight there's something you want to thank God for some testimony that you have, something that God has done, and you want to simply thank Him for it. Or maybe tonight you want to pray for someone in the younger generation, someone in your family who's out of church, or you try to bring them and they don't want to have anything to do with it, and it burdens you. Maybe tonight you want to pray for them and pray that God would give you the opportunities to show them, just through the testimonies of your own life, what God is capable of, what He's done. And pray that maybe God will open their eyes to the truth of who He is. Maybe not God's laid something else in your heart and you want to use this time to pray about anything that you feel like tonight. Lord, I pray these next few minutes, if you've laid something on our hearts, that we would use this time to simply pray, to talk to you. Lord, I pray that good things would happen because of the prayers offered tonight. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. As Miss Doris plays, just use this time to pray, whatever's on your heart.